who is he going to put sanctions on? He's going to put sanctions on China? He can't do that. The Chinese control the flow of rare earths to the United States, and they send magnets to the United States that we desperately need. The Chinese have all sorts of coercive leverage over us. And the Indians, the other country that matters here with regard to secondary sanctions, the Indians have made it clear that they cannot agree to Trump's demands. So what is secondary sanctions going to do? And in terms of arming the Ukrainians, he's already arming the Ukrainians. He hasn't shut down the Biden pipeline. And he's told the Europeans they can buy American equipment and ship it to the Ukrainians, which is just a way of saying that American equipment will continue to be sent to Ukraine. It'll just go via Europe and the Europeans will pay for it. But the Ukrainians are still going to get the weaponry. I just don't understand what he can do. The guy doesn't have any options. This is what I don't understand about this whole process and what I think is so mind-boggling about it.
Yeah.
We don't have any coercive leverage over the Russians, and they're winning on the battlefield. And the idea that Trump is going to go to Alaska on Friday and get all these concessions from the Russians, and then if the Russians don't make these concessions, he's going to lower the boom on them. What is he talking about? If you read the reports on what he told the Europeans yesterday, apparently he said that he was going to push for a ceasefire. But today he is saying that he's interested not in a ceasefire, but he's interested in a real deal. He wants to end the war. He can only do one of those two things. And he says one thing one day and a different thing the next day. So who knows exactly what his position is going to be going into these talks. But the fact is, he's never going to agree to the principal Russian demands. And until he comes to agree with those demands, you're not going to get a meaningful agreement between Putin and Trump. And then you want to understand that's not the end of the story, because there are more than two players in this game. The other two players are the Ukrainians and the Europeans. And even if Trump and Putin were to agree, the other two wouldn't agree with the deal that the two of them worked out.
Yesterday,
what could he do? There's all this talk about increasing armaments to Ukraine. We've been down this road probably 50 times. There's nothing we can do there. We've got an empty cupboard for the most part. And with regard to sanctions, as I just said, and countless people have said on your show and countless people have said in other places, that's not a meaningful card to play. And by the way, what we haven't talked about is the fact that the Russians are now winning in a serious way on the battlefield. If you look at what's happening there, if anything, this just plays to Putin's position, not to Trump's position tomorrow. Let's just talk about why we're having this meeting. 2 weeks ago, nobody thought a meeting like this was possible because the two sides were miles apart. So the question you want to ask yourself is, why are we having this meeting tomorrow? And the answer is that Trump had previously threatened to levy secondary sanctions on Russia, which meant that India and China, in all likelihood, would be clobbered. And that was going to happen on August 8th. But as we inched towards the August 8th date, he came to realize that he did not want to do that. So he sent Steve Witkoff scurrying off to Moscow to ask Putin to have this meeting. It came out of nowhere. Putin, of course, agreed to the meeting because he understood the pickle that Trump was in. So we get the meeting, and on August 8th, there were no secondary sanctions. So Trump solved the problem. But here he is in the clip that you just showed, talking about sanctions again. And out of the pickle, and now he's getting back into the pickle. This is just hard to understand. Why is he threatening very severe sanctions when that card is not worth playing? And in fact, it's just going to lead to all sorts of trouble because he can't employ it against the Chinese. They have too much coercive leverage. The Indians have told him that they will not play along. And if anything, what this is going to do, it's going to drive the Indians into the arms of the Russians. Is that in our interest? Of course not. It's Putin's advantage in a really big way tomorrow. Putin has no reason to want to compromise at this point in time, given events on the battlefield. And Colonel McGregor is correct. And again, this plays to Trump's advantage. And the other thing is, I've stressed before, it's very important to understand that what's happening in Ukraine from Russia's point of view is an existential threat. People in the West, for the most part, refuse to accept the logic of that position. But it doesn't mean anything whether they in the West accept or reject Putin's thinking. What matters is what Putin and his lieutenants think. They all think they're facing an existential threat, and they think it's absolutely essential that these demands that they've put on the table be accepted by Ukraine and the West. But we refuse to accept those demands. The Ukrainians do, and the Europeans do. So again, I get back to the question I asked you before. Where do we get an agreement here? What's the basis of an agreement? I don't see any basis of a peace settlement. I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that I've been missing the obvious. We've gone back and forth, the two of us. You've talked to all sorts of other people on your show, and nobody sees a magic solution to this problem. And I think that's because there is none. So this is all to his advantage. And I would also note that he is setting foot in the United States. He is landing in the United States. And this is a symbolic move. It gives him a certain amount of legitimacy to come to the United States to talk to President Trump. So he really has nothing to lose tomorrow. And we've seen enough of him to know that he's a very sophisticated strategist. He's a very sophisticated diplomat, whether you agree with what he's doing or not. He's not the kind of person you want to give an opportunity to demonstrate how reasonable he is and how smart he is. And of course, that's exactly what's going to happen tomorrow. From the very beginning, Trump was playing a very difficult hand on Ukraine and on other issues when he walked into the White House on January 20th. That meant that he had to be very strategic. He had to be very cunning, very smart about how to deal with all those people that you were just describing. But did he behave in a strategically smart way? Did he calculate how best to negotiate through these obstacle-filled waters? Of course not. He did none of that. He just thought he could fly by the seat of his pants and get by. And the end result is he has lost to those different foreign policy establishments. The key question on the table is whether or not Trump is going to accept the Russian demand that those 4 oblasts that they now partially control and Crimea will be part of a greater Russia. That's the question on the table. And he never answers that. Second point I'd make to you is after he talked to the European leaders yesterday, the whole issue of territory and land swaps was taken off the table. He made it clear to the Europeans that they were not going to talk about land swaps unless the Ukrainians were present at the table. So he was talking about that issue before yesterday, but now he's no longer talking about that. And the reason he's no longer talking about that is land swaps are unacceptable to the Europeans, unacceptable to the Ukrainians, unacceptable to the Keith Kellogg's of the world. And the end result is it's not even worth going down that road because it's just not going to happen. So the Europeans are buying weaponry from us, right? They're getting American weaponry. It's just that the Europeans are buying it, they're paying for it, and they're giving it to the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians are not going to run out of weaponry because once the Biden pipeline dries up, there'll be no Trump pipeline. There will be a Trump pipeline through the Europeans. What has screwed the Ukrainians big time is not the weapons problem. They do have a weapons deficit for sure, but the real problem is a manpower deficit. They have run out of infantry. They have run out of trigger pullers. And the end result is they don't have sufficient forces to thickly populate the front lines. When you're in a war of attrition and you have 2 armies standing toe to toe, if you're the defender like the Ukrainians are, you have to thickly populate the front lines. You have to have lots of troops up there to parry the offensives by the Russians. And the problem is that the Ukrainians are so short of manpower that they can't populate the line in any meaningful way. And that presents the Russians with all sorts of opportunities to penetrate the defensive position of the Ukrainians. One, I do think the fact that they will not be able to come up with a meaningful agreement in terms of the Ukraine war will push them in the direction that you described. It'll push them to talk about the things they can agree on, which is the more general relationship between Russia on one side and the United States on the other. So I think you'll see that tomorrow. The second point I'd make to you, though, Judge, is it's hard to see how you can reset U.S.-Russian relations as long as the Ukraine war is not settled. And you want to think about where this train is headed, because it's quite clear that the Ukrainian military cannot hang on that much longer. Witness what you just said about Colonel McGregor's views. And at some point, when it collapses, when it begins to fall back to the Dnieper River or whatever, the question you have to ask yourself is, how will the West, especially the United States, react to this? Are we just going to accept that? Or are we going to double down and try and do everything we can to rescue the Ukrainians and cause trouble for the Russians? I bet that we do the latter. And that, again, will cut into any improvement in the overall relationship that we see as a result of tomorrow's meeting. We're going to be doing everything we can in the West to undermine Russia's position in Ukraine, or in those areas of Ukraine that it incorporates into Russia. And the Russians are going to be doing everything they can to cause trouble in Ukraine, to make sure that Ukraine remains a dysfunctional rump state. They're going to do everything they can to sow dissension in the transatlantic relationship, to sow dissension in Europe. I have no doubt about this. And I also, as I've said on the show, think there are potential flashpoints in places like the Arctic, Kaliningrad, the Baltic Sea, Belarus, Moldova, and the Black Sea for trouble to break out. So I understand all of that. But that's very different than saying that the Russians are bent on conquering all of Ukraine or conquering territory in East Europe. I don't think they're going to do that. Again, I think they're going to build up their defenses. They'd be foolish not to. They're dealing with a highly aggressive West, and they're dealing with a Ukraine that's going to want to restore the pre-2014 borders. So they'll spend a lot of money building up their defenses. And again, we'll have poisonous relations between the two sides. And this is regrettable, but this is where we're headed. There is zero evidence that Putin is interested in conquering all of Ukraine. There is zero evidence that he is interested in conquering countries in Eastern Europe. I just don't understand how these people can make this argument. Where is the evidence? I want them to show me where Putin said, I want to conquer all of Ukraine and incorporate it into a greater Russia. Where did he say that? He said it nowhere. Furthermore, as you and I both know very well, Danny, he would be out of his mind to try to conquer all of Ukraine, because the western half of that country is filled with ethnic Ukrainians who hate Russians and would put up great resistance. He would need a huge army to occupy western Ukraine, and that army would be up to its eyeballs in alligators trying to deal with all of that resistance. He's going to have his hands full just trying to reintegrate the eastern portion of Ukraine that he ends up conquering into Russia. That's not going to be easy. He's going to have all sorts of problems. Just think about all the destruction that has been inflicted on that region that's going to become part of Russia. It's very great. So he's not going to try to conquer all of Ukraine. And he's never said that he would. And again, the same thing is true with Eastern Europe. But we have all these people in the West who continue to talk without evidence about Putin's ardent desire to basically reconstitute the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire. What happens to the Ukrainian army over time? In other words, let's assume that the Ukrainian army begins to collapse in the Donetsk area or in the Donbass, and the Russians begin to push toward the Dnieper. What does that mean for Russian forces in other regions? Do you have a near total collapse of the Ukrainian military? Is it a partial collapse? Where do they retreat to? What do the defensive lines look like? I've never believed that the Russians were going to try to win a decisive victory. In other words, a victory where they conquered all of Ukraine. That's not going to happen. I believe you will end up with a Ukrainian rump state, and that Ukrainian rump state will have a military. But the question is, how much damage is going to be done to the overall Ukrainian army in the next month or two or three? And what does that mean in terms of Ukraine keeping hold of places like Odessa and Kharkiv and other oblasts in between? If you're the Russians and you listen to the Europeans and the Ukrainians and the Keith Kellogg's of the world talk, it seems to me that the lesson that you take from that is you better grab as much territory as you can. You better make sure that remaining Ukrainian rump state is as crippled as possible, because they're going to try to cause trouble for you for the foreseeable future. And the best way you minimize the amount of trouble that Ukrainian rump state can take is to take as much territory as possible, certainly to take areas like Odessa and Kharkiv. So I think just how this all plays out in the next couple months in terms of how extensive the collapse of the Ukrainian army will be is of great importance.